We are going to start this morning with my fireside chat with Joe about how to build a profitable company in shared micromobility. So, Joe, if you want to come up with me on the stage, Joe is president of Lime. He oversees both hardware and software, and probably even more than that. Joe is a former GP at Google Ventures, where he was an investor in Lime. He's also a two-time entrepreneur. And please join me in welcoming Joe to the stage. Let's give him a round of applause. Joe, thank you for being here. It's so wonderful to have you. Joe, my first question has to be about profitability because it's in the name of the panel. So let's talk about this. Walk me through the journey towards profitability for Lime.
Okay, so last year, Lime announced that it was on an EBITDA basis profitable. Just looking ahead to this year, I think we'll grow about 26% over last year, and our profitability increased by about 6.6 times. So we continue to expand margin. Should be free cash flow positive. And in a business where you're spending quite a substantial amount in CapEx to deploy, tens and tens of thousands of vehicles across the world, at least for us, that's a real meaningful achievement. I think one of the things that we did to get there, and first, I just want to say that I think any startup, whether, when I was on the investing side and as an entrepreneur, I look at, your job is to essentially retire risk in a sequential fashion because there's tons of doubt when you start anything, right? There's doubt that you can build the product. There's doubt that there's a market for the product. There's doubt that even if there is, you can make a business in the product. So I look at any startup's journey, and I imagine there might be several people who are starting companies in the audience, as a progressive retirement of risk. And it's like qualifying for the Olympics. You start in the local race, and then you go to the regionals, and you go to the state, and then you go to the nationals, you get to the Olympics. And each time, as you retire one risk, it simply qualifies you for the next level of skepticism that people have. And that's great. That's just the way it works. So you're kind of qualifying against another higher level of competitors. And honestly, the first thing that we had to retire was the risk that, hey, look, shared micromobility might be a great service to offer, but all it is a subsidy from investors into the hands of and the pocketbooks of customers. So it's a great thing to be a customer of. It's a terrible thing to be a business owner of. And so the thing that we have been laser focused on for the last 3 years is retiring that risk. And I honestly think the way that we did it was to conceptualize a few things. The first was, and the most important thing, whether you're an entrepreneur or in this business, is to know what kind of business you're in. That old adage about, I think, the train companies not realizing they were in the transportation business, thinking they were in the train business, and then kind of missing the whole automotive wave. I think we've recognized from the very beginning that we're in the transportation business. And there is a law of physics in the transportation business. And that law of physics is that it is a low margin, high volume business. And the death of so many companies is believing this time it's different. You look back to the kind of initiation of the scooter craze back in, 2017, 2018, you might have fooled yourself into believing that this time it was different, right? Because demand was crazy off the charts. And vehicles were lasting no time at all, like 30 days, I think, was how long a vehicle lasted when I first invested into Lime. I put $100 million of Google's money into Lime before I joined the company and was on the board. But you could fool yourself into believing this time it was different. This was the one part of the transportation segment that was not going to be low margin, high volume. It's going to be high margin, high volume. Sounds great. It'll look like SaaS software. It's just not the case. So we have focused from the very beginning. This is understanding the physics of the game. It is a low margin, high volume business. You have one and only one business strategy when you were involved in a low margin, high volume business. That is, you must be the lowest cost provider of the highest quality service. That's it. You have to focus extremely on cost of service delivery and grinding that to as low as possible. You also have big price sensitivity in this space because transportation is a highly competitive segment. So knowing what kind of business we're in, focusing on a strategy that was deeply focused on costs in a complicated business motion was really the main thing.
As I get my papers from the floor, I want to talk for a second about your definition of profitability, because you had mentioned two things. You'd mentioned last year you were profitable from an EBITDA perspective, and then this year you're looking at profitability from a cash flow perspective. So, maybe two questions as part of this. How is that definition important to you? How is that definition important to your investors? And then the second question is, when you become profitable, like how much more wildly profitable do you expect to be, or do you think at some point, like there's just going to be a cap at your level of profitability?
Yeah. Um, so let me define some terms because I wouldn't anticipate that everybody spends their, leisure hours understanding the difference between EBITDA, what that even is, and free cash flow positive. But just to kind of lay it out, essentially, if you go through a P&L, you have the amount of money that the business is making on an operations basis. So essentially, profit that comes out the bottom. But then you have to spend money in order to maybe grow and invest in your business. So in Amazon's case, okay, they make a bunch of profit and cash from selling goods, but then if they made, let's say for every dollar that they made, they had to invest 2 in new warehouses to grow the business. You have positive, in this case, EBITDA, but you would be negative free cash flow because you're investing more of your cash in order to continue to grow the business. So that's really the difference between your operations can make money, but on a cash basis, if I looked at my cash balance at the beginning of the year, my cash balance at the end of the year, it goes down even though the business made money because you're investing to continue to grow the business. Any capital intensive business like Lime, you have to think about 2 kinds of capital investment. You have to think about, what do I have to spend to just maintain where I am today? So if we look at Lime's fleet at, call it 270,000 vehicles globally in 32 countries, what do we have to pay every year just to keep the fleet stable, right? Because things end up somehow in the river, or, somebody does some hard riding and puts it on Instagram. Then what do we have to spend? What can we spend to grow? And so the key in free cash flow positive is I love the Buffett quote, or you see Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett every year up, and even though their bodies continue to fail them, their minds are as sharp as ever. I love those guys. And so what the Charlie Munger quote is always, whenever you see the word EBITDA, just substitute the phrase BS earnings. He actually said the word. I'm not going to say it. He gets the right to say those words.
I think we could blank it out if you
so
yeah.
So
the audience knows what that word is.
So free cash flow, you cannot hide. There is nothing to hide. If I looked at the balance, if I looked at how much money you have in the bank at the beginning of the year, how much money you have in the end of the year, you have more money than you did at the beginning of the year. And that is the key is while we are growing 30+% year on year. So a business to be able to grow and generate cash is a very high bar, and it's one that I'm very excited about for Lime this year.
Interesting. So I'm curious, you joined Lime, 5 years ago? And then it was about 5 3/4 years. I think you were saying that you've been involved in Lime because that was when you had made the investment at Lime. So when you joined Lime, did you have a sense of your own timeline to try to get to profitable?
Okay, so
Were you hired to, they were like, you know what, Joe, you're coming in and you're going to make this profitable?
it was a tall order when you looked at what the business looked like. There's some amount of, whenever you're an investor, you got to do a lot of squinting. And actually the process I used and still use today, because I still do some investing as a personal matter. Whenever I'm looking at something or listening to an entrepreneur tell me about their idea, their Series A idea, especially early on, I use a process. And the question I ask myself is, if I went to sleep for a decade, Sleeping Beauty style, and I were to wake up, would I see more of what this entrepreneur is talking about in the world, or I'm not sure? And if I'm not sure, then I just pass and I say, great, I wish you the best of luck. I'd love to stay in touch. Let me know how I can help. And if it's, yeah, I'm pretty sure I will, then I dive deeper into understanding, well, is now the right time? And is this the entrepreneur? And the reason this is the important question is that no startup of any kind can raise enough money to make a market. If I gave any one of you $1 billion to start a cucumber-flavored toothpaste company right now, I guarantee you would burn through all your money and all you do is give away samples and there would be no market. So the reason this question is clarifying for me on if I went to sleep for a decade, it's because you're looking for the mega trends that make something inevitable. Investors look for things that are inevitable, whether you exist or not. Then the question is, can I make this company that I'm talking to the one that's going to lead. It's that old adage of the best way to lead a parade is find one that's happening and go run out in front of it. And when I looked at Lime as a venture investor, this was the question I asked. This is my pattern. And so I asked myself the question, if I close my eyes in a decade, am I going to see more alternatives to cars in cities, or am I not sure? And I was very sure, yes, I would see more alternatives to cars. I'm willing to bet a lot, $100 million in this particular case. Now, am I also quite confident we're going to see more infrastructure to support these alternatives? Bike lanes is, probably the form they would take. Yes. Now, what was I not sure of? Was it going to look like a scooter or bike? I didn't know. Was it going to be shared, or was it going to be privately owned, or some mix of both? And how did I think about that mix? I had no idea. So those were the things that got me positively inclined. But when you look at Lime financials in 2018, negative 300% gross margins, scooters lasting 30 days, complete chaos in operations, a broken supply chain, and I could make a spreadsheet that said how we were going to transform that business into a profit-making free cash flow enterprise. But a spreadsheet is simply numbers on a page that have to be translated into actions. I love to say this about micromobility, shared micromobility in particular. There is no greater cash incineration machine on this planet than shared micromobility done poorly. It is a great way to incinerate lots and lots of capital. And it's because the business motion is so complex. We're vertically integrated. We're the only company that still designs, engineers, manufactures, ships its own hardware, and then operates it in 32 countries and 250 plus cities at scale.
And actually, on that point, I'm curious. So how much of your profitability comes from Europe and Australia and New Zealand versus from North America?
Our business is about 55 to 60% Europe, about 35 to 40% US, and about 5% Australia, New Zealand.
Do you see that changing?
Yeah, actually, I think that this continues to diversify globally. There's a number of markets that are up and coming. I think North America will continue to grow. I think it's lagged just because, European cities are made for horses and humans as opposed to cars. Cars have always been a retrofit. They've invested more in public transit networks that leave last mile problems. They've invested in bike lanes for alternatives to cars. They're very aggressive, much more aggressive on climate objectives. U.S. cities think about safety and quality of life issues. So they have an incentive and a desire to get cars out of cities, but there's less immediate urgency. But I do think Canada will continue to grow. Right now, we don't serve really Central and South America, which I think those markets continue to be interesting. Japan isn't really open. It's just starting to be open to these things. So I continue to think there's a lot of embedded growth.
No, it's the same. Am I hearing in your answer too that you all are going to do some geographic expansions at some point?
We are very disciplined on where we go. And so, I'll give you an example. We had something on the order of 2 years ago, we had something on the order of 15,000 vehicles in Korea. We shut the market down. Wouldn't make money in Korea. It's not that there isn't a ton of interest in Korea on micromobility. It's that the governmental framework and the insane levels of willingness to lose money hand over fist in local competitors just made that market unattractive. It may be attractive again in someday. So I don't want to commit to any of the timing, but we're constantly reevaluating all these markets.
That's okay. I'm not going to make you commit to any of the timing on this stage. But I do want to ask first actually about bad decisions. So you seem like an extremely thoughtful person that probably doesn't make bad decisions. But I am curious. I am curious from the perspective of this journey to profitability. When you look back, what were the obvious bad decisions? You were like, why did we do that? We should have just never done that as we were trying to, drive costs down, increase growth, et cetera.
When you look back at any company's trajectory, what you will find is in retrospect, you only needed to get the big decisions right. And usually there's not that many big decisions. The problem is, as you're working forward in time, you have no idea which of these decisions really is the big one or the big two or big three you need to get right. So unfortunately, the idea that you only need to get 3 or 4 big decisions right in the life of any company is useless advice because you can't tell which ones necessarily are the big ones. But I can absolutely identify the biggest mistake I made in this business along the journey that we've had. And that is when we have failed to lean into risk on technical, on our next generation of vehicles. And we not hesitated to do this. I probably put $70 million of CapEx into a prior generation of vehicle instead of leaning into our newer generations of vehicles. And that caused, we don't have inventory in the way that like many consumer businesses have, but imagine getting stuck with millions of dollars of inventory that you can't liquidate. And that is what this feels like. It feels like I've converted my most precious asset, fungible cash, into an asset that is parked in a cul-de-sac and I can't do anything about it. And it took us several years to work ourselves through that and make those assets productive. So if I've learned one thing, it is I am always leaning in to the technical risk and believing that while there is risk, in whatever we deploy, I'm going to lean into it as opposed to shy away from it.
That's really interesting. So the message there being lean into the innovation. And also, I think, what's been reported on a lot, what you all have talked about a lot is just the quality of Lime's hardware has been the differentiator for you all. And it has been both from the perspective of the rider, but also from the perspective of cost, right? Because you're not constantly replacing these vehicles.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Joe, flip side of that question is what's a good decision that you've made?
I think we have gotten three big things right in this business that separate us. The first is, even when times were hard, even when we were losing substantial amounts of money, because it's easy to make, stepping back. For those of you who run companies, I think an adage you must live by, but it is so hard to do, is you make hard choices when you have choices. Most of us, if we're honest, only make hard choices when you have no other choices to make. Now you're forced. And I will give Wayne Ting, who's the CEO of Lime, great credit for living this principle. Let me give you an example, then I'll come back to your question. 6 months ago, we knew we were going to, grow. We were going to be free cash flow positive. And still, despite that, Wayne pushed the argument that we should continue to reduce OpEx by, on a run rate basis, 10%. That's an example of you make hard choices. That is a hard choice. Most people only reduce OpEx when they have no choice to make, but they're looking at the wall. I don't know how to teach this lesson as a VC. I would have loved to have figured out a way, and unfortunately some lessons can be taught, others have to be learned. Some people just don't have a particular disposition to want to do it. But making hard choices when you have choices is such a critical item. And here's an example. Now back to your question. I think we got three things right. One, we have never wavered in the design and development of our own hardware. Today we remain the only company in the shared space that does it. Everybody else buys from pretty much Segway non-bio. And from my point of view, as somebody who's been in consumer services most of their career, I don't know how you build customer preference in a world of abundance if you don't control your own product. And shared micromobility is not the experience you have on the app. That's an important part of the experience, but it's not the experience people associate with what you're doing. They associate it with the hardware that's out here, the ride that you take. So that's one. We have never wavered in that, even when times are hard, and we continue to do and invest in our own. And it costs us a lot in supply chain personnel. It costs us a lot in hardware design, industrial engineering, mechanical engineering, everything that many of you, I imagine, as manufacturers, if you're out there, have yourselves. Second, we've always controlled operations. This is an incredibly complex business motion. If I just took you down our P&L, discounts, refunds, fraud, promotion, payments fees, insurance fees, network fees, warehouse costs, tools and spare parts, depreciation, labor in the warehouse, labor out of the warehouse.
Memorize this or something.
I spend my waking life worrying about these things. And as a result, as I mentioned at the beginning, in a low margin, high volume business, you've got to nail the costs. We have never let go of control of operations. I would counter that with, let's say, Bird, who wanted to make their P&L look better by franchising out operations. So I'm going to pass along a lot of these costs to Joe Kraus's tow truck company in Seattle. That works great until me, as the tow truck company owner who's running the franchise, figures out, well, actually, this business is really hard. And getting all the costs out of the business is really hard. And all you did is transfer a tax that you were paying to me. And now they're in the process of unwinding that decision. And I think we got that big decision right. The last thing we've gotten, frankly, right, and I'm not sure I can perfectly identify all the reasons on how we did it, other than I think executive team tenure. But on the government affairs side, as everybody here knows, if I like to basically say that if Amazon had $1 billion to spend on shared micromobility, could they deploy any of it? No, they have to go win a bunch of permits. We happen to be good at the government affairs, government relations, partnering with cities. And now that we have such large-scale operations and we have seen everything that can go wrong in this business, safety issues, battery fires, fatalities, operations of any scale, I think we've established a track record that helps us, and now we win about 90% of the competitions that we enter in order to serve it. I think those are the three big things we've gotten right, and that have made a big difference.
Yeah, no, I mean, three things that when you're explaining them, you make them sound easy, but I imagine in practice, they're not only quite difficult, but also quite hard to measure, at any one moment in time. So I want to talk about cost, but I want to talk about it in two ways. And I'm going to also take moderator's prerogative and make this a little bit of a longer conversation because I have this question and then another one I want to ask you about. So from a cost perspective, I want to talk about price and labor. So price, prices of taking a scooter ride or taking a bike ride have gone up over time. And I imagine that is having some effect on your ridership levels, although right now it's been positive. How are you thinking about affordability of the rides at the same time as you're thinking about, profitability and trying to grow your ridership?
Mm. So I want to get this business. The first job was to get the business into free cash flow positive. Second job I think about is to get into what I would call the Walmart cycle. The Walmart cycle is essentially Walmart takes its scale to get prices, their costs of their goods down, to then turn around and give that to a portion of that margin back to customers to drive even greater scale, which drives even greater pricing power, which drives even greater savings to customers. That is the loop I want to get into. And I think we're finally getting to a point where we can get into that virtuous cycle. We know, again, I'm back to what are the laws of physics of really any business? Demand elasticity based on price is a law of physics in any business, unless you are a monopoly provider, in which there's no other way to get your service. And if you are, then government is coming for you someday, even if today is not that day. So I want to get into that virtuous cycle because we see the dynamic. We offer, one of the other things I think about in pricing in general is your pricing power is directly proportional to your value over the next best replacement. So when I look at the use cases, broadly speaking, of shared micromobility, I get into three buckets. Bucket one is global tourism, travel. It's a great way to see a city you've never been in before. And the reason is you care a lot about what the city feels like. You're there to explore. If I gave you a teleport button from your hotel in Paris and you could push it to get immediately to the Louvre, would you, when you're a tourist? 90% of the time you wouldn't, because you're interested in seeing all the places in between. Micromobility basically gives you a way better value over your alternative of being in a bus or a subway or an Uber. So there's very high value over replacement. What's that mean? Whenever you have high value over replacement, you got pricing power. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum, commuting. Here, you gave me a teleport button, I would push it like that, mouse pushing the wheel in those drug experiments where they basically push it until they die. I don't care about what's between point A and point B. I just want to get there. So here, you got a lot of alternatives. You have high price sensitivity. You have high frequency of usage. So we craft a lot of our pricing to orient towards how are people using the service, frequency of use, and value over replacement. But I want to, broadly speaking, get into that Walmart cycle, and we're close.
Fascinating. All right. Well, I will make this my last question because this has been a wonderful conversation, but I'm looking at my list of questions and I have about 20 others that I would love to ask you. And hope actually the audience members will be able to grab you before you end up leaving and maybe as or between trying out some of these other e-bikes and e-scooters. So last question is, we do have folks in the audience who are city policymakers. You mentioned that you win 90% of city tenders. So obviously you're doing something right with regards to government relations, to government procurement. But what else should city policymakers be doing for you for shared micromobility to make it easier? Maybe not the obvious answers, like bike lanes would be great, but
Sure.
yeah.
Well, I always step back and think about, are we aligned to the same objective? And I think we are, which is our mission in life is to replace all car trips under 5 miles in urban environments globally. Full stop. The why that I'm here, like, why am I doing what? My friends ask me, like, why are you struggling? Why do you push? Why do you do these things? You have lots of alternatives. Is because I had a moment when I was 46 years old. I'm 52 now, and I did a regrets minimization weekend where I imagined I was 80 years old. And I thought, how would I come to feel about my choices as a 46-year-old? And I was happy in the job I had. I was investing with partners $1 billion a year in startups all over the world. Space catapult companies and all crazy manner of things. It was great. My problem was I was telling everybody that carbon was the most important problem and doing precisely nothing with my energy, effort, vigor, drive. And that was the alignment of values that I needed. So I wanted to start off with whether I'm talking to European city regulators or US city regulators, I think we're very aligned with more alternatives to cars in cities and in our mission of trying to replace all car trips under 5 miles. The thing below that is where I think tension arises sometimes. So the first is, I think that city regulators often expect more of a 6-year-old technology than a 106-year-old technology in cars. It's the last time you got in a car that essentially automatically obeyed the speed limit. When's the last time you got in a car where you went under the no parking sign, tried to put in park, shut off, and it wouldn't? The answer, of course, is never. But those are things that we do, and it's not so much the technical burden of doing them. Of course we can. We can make that happen. The question is, why is that good for what you ultimately want, which is people out of cars? Because when the value proposition encounters that level of rider friction, let me give you an example. We track a metric internally we call rider defect. A defect is when you're driving along and suddenly the scooter or bike slows down and you don't know why. Or it stops operating, you don't know why. Or you try to park it, it doesn't work and you don't know why. This is a defect. 24% of our rides encounter a defect. 24%. Imagine 1 out of every 4 times you went to Amazon, it gives you a 404. Or it, rejected your credit card, or it just stopped responding, or whatever. You'd be like, F it, what am I doing here? We have the same objective. Get cars out of cities. And I understand why. I totally get why we want vehicles to slow down, or we want vehicles to not operate. But remember our objective. And remember that customers have choices. And if we want those choices, we got to make this a great service for everybody. That's what I would love to work together on and have a dialogue about how can we help each other in this way? Because we want the same things. And there are great intentions behind sometimes things that have unintended negative consequences.
I love that as the final call to action from this chat. The idea being that really what you need from regulators or policymakers is to join with you in making driving a car a little bit harder, and also maybe ease up slightly on the regulations or the expectations that they have from a younger technology. So, Joe, apart from never wanting to have cucumber flavored toothpaste and also trying to figure out what a regrets minimization weekend is, I feel like both I and the audience have gotten just a ton out of this conversation. So really, really appreciate you taking the time. Let's give Joe a very warm round of applause. And Joe, I hope you'll be sticking around a little bit. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.